Hello there, and welcome to episode 6 of Rethinking Trauma and Transition. And today it is about Sweat Dreams Are Made of These.
Well, is it episode 6, Rich? Or is it just the episode about sweet dreams?
Well, we'll find out, won't we?
So, what are we going to talk about today then?
We're talking about flashbacks. We're talking about night terrors and sleep in general as well.
So, probably for most of everybody that's been listening, I think it's quite good, I suppose, to link it back to what we've been talking about previously, which is the experience of PTSD, post-traumatic stress injury.
Yep.
And there, in that episode, we covered off some common symptoms or experiences that people have when they have post-traumatic stress. And we committed at that point to doing a bit of a deeper dive on some of these. And we're not necessarily going to beat these to death. They are, but it's going to give a bit more detail, hopefully, for everybody about what the component elements of these are and terms of what we've experienced. That sounds fair?
Oh, yeah. We're just going to be giving you an overview as to what they are, a bit more deeper than what the previous episodes were.
Yeah. And maybe also our take on what's actually happening in our heads when that's going on and why that happens as well.
Definitely. And some possible ways that you could remedy your situation as well. Obviously, we are not prescribing anything, so we'll cover all that later.
Yeah, and hopefully with the increased understanding of why your brain's operating the way it is and how that is then structured, then sometimes that can have a positive impact as well in the experience.
Definitely, yeah.
So shall we jump right in? And the first one we were going to talk about was the flashbacks, because a lot of people with post-traumatic stress injuries will experience flashbacks. For anybody else that hasn't, though, sometimes the question is, well, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so, I think most people think of a flashback as a visual trigger in the memory, but it also can be physical. It can be with the smell. It can be hearing something. So, for example, in my case, a few years ago now, I was working for a utility company. And so we're often out and about in cherry pickers or MEWPs. Being back in that cage, moving that vehicle about on site, which over bumpy terrain, caused me to have actual physical flashbacks. And so I wasn't able to control the MEWP as well as I could. So that bumping into things and all that sort of stuff, it brought me back to being back out in like Northern Ireland and Iraq doing top cover. And being in a metal frame thing, getting bounced about on the roads and all that kind of stuff.
So when you talk about a physical flashback, Rich, what were you experiencing at that point when you were in mid flashback?
So it was causing me to have elevated heart rate. My breathing was more rapid. I was getting very tense in my muscles, and that kind of thing.
What were the thoughts that were going through your head when you were experiencing those? What emotions were those that were happening?
It wasn't really emotional, and my mind was mostly blank, which you probably realise is quite a common thing, Ali.
Well, I think with flashbacks, yeah, it can be.
Yeah.
So does that mean almost that there was the... Because that sounds an awful lot like the physical symptoms of anxiety or a panic attack, but with almost like the thinking shutdown that goes with it, so that actually everything's focused very much in the physical experience and everything else is really closed in and tight.
Yeah, it was quite tunnel visioned as well, along with tunnel hearing, which is not many people know about.
So tell me a bit more about that tunnel vision and tunnel hearing.
So auditory and visual exclusion, it's very hard to start hearing people. You're just very focused on where you're going. Because I was working in quite confined areas as well, that mean I'll be very near or hitting other bits of equipment that supposed to be staying away from. And then on some occasions, it actually unfortunately damaged that equipment because I was focusing too intently on where I wanted to go and not everything else that was going on around me.
So is that a bit like looking through almost like a pipe to your destination, so that everything seems further away, that maybe there's the peripheral vision is so closed down that actually all you're seeing is a very narrow window at the end of that tunnel?
Yeah, very much. It's like that racehorse with the blinkers on. Not comparing myself to a racehorse, but yeah, the racehorse blinkers on. It knows where it's going. Nothing's going to distract from the outside of it, and it's just heading there for the finishing line. And with the auditory exclusion, because the engine's running as well, it's hard to hear people's voices on the ground to say, "Whoa, stop, slow down. You need to do this, that, and the other."
It also strikes me though that in terms of the specific experience that you're describing, Rich, it also strikes me that those very experiences in certain circumstances would be incredibly useful, because what you're really describing is almost that heightened point of focus,
Yeah,
intensity of focus.
yeah, very useful in some situations, but unuseful in others, as you say.
Which I suppose is the interesting point. It comes back to, I suppose, the phrase I used in the previous podcast about a weed being a plant out of place. And that's a useful skill that's out of place now.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. So for me, one of the triggers was walking towards the actual, without even getting into it, is going sense of kind of foreboding, I suppose, of no, I've got to drive this thing over the terrain, but I still had to do it because it's part of the job.
So this was almost anticipatory dread then. So you know what's going to happen, you know what's coming next. And it's almost like you're future pacing that experience before it happens.
Yeah.
So when would the tunneling start for you then?
It'd be when I start moving and operating a vehicle.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was the experience as because you said it started as you were walking towards the vehicle, that anticipatory dread? Was there anything else that was almost giving you an indication of a warning that this was something that?
It was a knowing that I think is doing a job, and his job's got to be done because that's what the role is. So it's as we mentioned earlier, it's about all these boundaries and boundary settings, and having that totally encroached. Where, as in the forces, and I'm sure there's quite a few other jobs, is go out there and do the job because of that can-do attitude, and it's part of the job to do it and get it done.
Okay. So for you, those triggers then were very much, I suppose I would class them almost as kinesthetic. They're about the feeling and the sensation that then triggers further feelings and sensations in you because it's associated with previous experiences.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, definitely kinesthetic. Then it would become, as you say, it become then visual and auditory as well.
So that almost means then that trigger is almost like a bridge to a previous experience, which then working on that idea of something, it being a useful skill that's out of place, that bridge then links to that skill, kicks that skill in, and that skill, because it's out of place, which is that tunneling and that focus, now becomes an issue.
Yeah. And it's not just an issue for me, it'd be an issue for everybody I'm working with as well.
Because they would be largely unaware that this was happening to you also.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of those those flashbacks, I mean, what we're talking about here are the things that trigger them, really.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a lot of things that can trigger those flashbacks. So what may be a, say, pleasant smell for someone could be rather upsetting and disgusting for somebody else.
Well, I suppose it's almost that peanut butter and Marmite debate. For some people, they absolutely love them. For others, it's kind of like the devil's food.
Well, you're not wrong, yeah. But and I'm not sure if people are aware out there, I'm sure some people are, is that the sense of smell that goes straight into the back of the brain. There's no filter with that compared to the sense of touch, taste, hearing, and sight.
I suppose that would be why most people find certain smells really quite
Pleasant.
pleasant. Like, for instance, fresh baked baked bread. Too many R's in that.
There is early morning coffee.
Early morning coffee, yeah, or fresh cut grass.
Mm-hmm.
Unless, of course, you've got chronic hay fever, at which point that's probably not a smell you want to smell at all.
No. Then there's the other side of things, which could be the smell of vomit, blood, and all these other, and even the sight of it can trigger other people off into having a reaction to that as well.
Well, you know, when we were talking about this podcast, I was saying that for me, actually, it's sometimes it's the sound as well, because I used to work in the license trade in the pubs for a long period of time, and there were certain sounds, and one of those would be somebody being sick that you would think, oh, your heart would sink. You knew that you were probably going to spend the next little while with them. Yeah, plastic bag, a scoop, and that was going to be a joyful end to your night. Yeah. But to come back to those flashbacks then, because the flashbacks that you've described there are very much about the feeling and the sensation, but what other types of flashbacks are there? How else might somebody experience a flashback?
That could be through auditory. So not so common now, but years ago used to be a lot of cars going off rear end, banging. You know, somebody might mistake that for gunfire if they've been out in on tour somewhere, or they've experienced being in the middle of school shooting or whatever it is. Yeah, or fireworks even. And so if you've got a partner, you've got young kids, how do you deal with that? By maybe compromising, putting earplugs in, and looking yourself after that way.
Well, I think a common one that probably you and I hear a lot is people being triggered by the sounds of children laughing and playing, because actually the volume and the tone of those sounds is very, very similar to almost sounds of excitement or panic or upset, and they can be really, really emotive triggers for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So in terms of, again, the structure of that flashback, does that then mean that while you've then got the auditory trigger going on there, is there almost like an auditory soundtrack that can play with that, so that you're almost internalizing and replaying a previous soundtrack?
Not for me, no, because most of those journeys were done in silence.
But maybe for other people?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely, yeah. There's no reason why not.
Okay.
Because one flashback or a particular part of a flashback could then build on another part. So, as you said, in my case, it's kinesthetics. So the visual and the auditory could be built on top of that. And then maybe there might be some taste to it, you know, the taste of engine fumes, or taste, or the smell of diesel, or whatever the case may be.
So that would then possibly mean then that flashbacks can almost be single representations, or almost like a sequencing.
Yeah.
That you're thrown into the middle.
Yeah.
Of. Because I'm assuming from what you've described, Rich, that sounds almost as if there was a sequencing that you would then re-experience within it.
Yeah.
Whereas for some people experiencing flashbacks, it might be, for instance, single sounds, images, single smells that again are bridging back to that previous experience. and pulling forward those really powerful emotional responses.
Yeah, which are really anchors, deep anchors, aren't they?
Very much, yeah. And I think sometimes when we talk about triggers, we're almost underestimating the skill of our own brains. Because what you and I have just been describing is bridges between experiences, bridges that our brain can create in a snap second between us in the present and our experiences or memories of the past.
Yeah. And those sensations can be just milliseconds apart. You don't even maybe notice that bridging effect. It all seems instantaneous.
That literally means then that for instance, for yourself, when you're experiencing that flashback, that what you've got is the full fibre equipment or equivalent of that bridging skill. You know, for other people who maybe will be able to make the connection between sensory input and memory, because let's face it, a big common one for most of us is music. You know, there'll be key anthems from our younger maybe teenage years or early 20s or whatever, and if you haven't reached early 20s yet, then I'm really jealous. And
we're still on early 20s, Ali.
We're still in our early 20s. But there'll be key pieces of music or sounds that take us back to a moment in time, or it could be, for instance, like maybe the theme tune of a favorite TV program from our childhood. And I'm not going to start to list some of them because then I'll feel really old. But there was one very, very specific one which involved a rather cool helicopter, and that's all I'm going to say. But in terms of those bridges, though, I think sometimes we forget that while these are not experiences that any of us would want as a regular part of our lives, they're actually evidence of a very, very refined skill set there.
And these are all experiences that I had during the daytime. And we can talk about the nighttime stuff as well, which you had a very good analogy, I think, Ali, didn't you, before?
Well, I do like to tell stories, don't I? But I think that's where, again, the way we process information is really, really important. And I think sometimes it's also about not underestimating that in some situations, in a way, what we're talking about here are those of us who literally have that higher level, higher speed processing capacity that not everybody has. Now, that means that people like yourself, for instance, Rich, have the ability to create those bridges very, very quickly. And those bridges are also what then potentially lead to those bridges are the very thing that sometimes lead to things like phobias and phobic responses with people. Because again, they're bridging one experience or piece of input to another, and it's not always right.
Yeah.
In terms of the nighttime experience, if that's a daytime experience, then in a way, night terrors are a bit like flashbacks in our sleep. But for a lot of people, it's grasping the categoric difference between a night terror and a nightmare, and they are in a whole different league.
Yeah. What are the kind of symptoms that people experience during a night terror, Ali?
With a night terror, because nightmares are scary enough. Night terrors can envision that element of panic. Literally, it's like a sleep contained panic attack. And the difference between a panic attack and an anxiety attack is anxiety is about the future. A panic attack is where your brain is telling you that you're in You're at risk of imminent threat or death, and it is in the immediate present. It is happening now, and therefore you have to react. Your fight, flight, freeze kicks in, and your brain is screaming at you, this has to be acted on right here, right now. There has to be no delay.
And some people become somnambulistic as well through those experiences, don't they? Just to possibly wanting to get away from experiencing that at night.
Literally, the night terror can become a reenactment of something.
Mm-hmm.
It can be where the individual experiencing it will be literally reenacting a key sequence of events, maybe a key experience, and they won't. That means that while they might be acting, they might even have their eyes open, Rich. So that might be that, to all intents and purposes, they might look like they're awake, but they're anything but. That also means then that they're not aware of what and who they're interacting with while that's going on. And that can be scary for them as they come out of the night terror and become aware, but also for the people around about them seeing that, because there may well be, they might be shouting out, they might be screaming, they might be expressing that fear verbally, they might be quite
physical
in their actions. There might be, high levels of distress that are physically being displayed. So all of those are possible responses within the scope of a night terror. But part and parcel of that is also about our brain desperately trying to process our experiences. And that analogy is, in a way, sometimes when we're experiencing night terrors and even nightmares as well, because that can have the same impact. During our day-to-day lives, we literally are bombarded with billions and billions of bite-sized pieces of data, of sensory input, and across the entire spectrum of our sensory experiences. Now, that means that in order for us not to be in overload and overwhelm all of the time, there has to be some level of automatic processing. So, without necessarily naming a specific brand, because there are a number of different distribution warehouses, if you imagine a very giant and very large and complex distribution warehouse that's dealing with all sorts of input, all sorts of customer orders and requirements, all sorts of parcels, because that's what each of that pieces, or each piece of that data input is. It's like a specific parcel. That means that at some point, in order to cope with that, they would install, they would automate that line so that anything that is familiar, that is commonplace, that goes to the same place time after time is automatically sorted, sifted, and dealt with, and it doesn't require a direct decision making on it.
So that, sorry, I need to interrupt you. That goes into then the subconscious processing, doesn't it?
Yes. So there are key things and that we can almost experience the impact of that. Like, for instance, the fact that very few of us will smell our own laundry detergent on our clothes. It'll be there, but we won't be aware of it because it's the laundry detergent we use all of the time, and therefore familiarity means it becomes automatically processed and not something we need to consciously process.
And it's also said that consciously we can only process 7 things with plus or minus 2. Anything above and beyond that is just too much for the conscious brain to analyze.
Well, the other thing is
complete overwhelm.
Sometimes the lovely experiences when we unintentionally pull an unconscious process back into the conscious, and by doing so we fritz it. So I'll give you an example of that, where I had a pattern unlock on my mobile phone, and it was going swimmingly well until I hadn't had to use it for a while, and it suddenly popped up and asked for my pattern. Because I wasn't expecting it, I thought about it instead of just inputting the pattern, and I was locked out of my phone for 4 hours because I could not, for love nor money, consciously remember that pattern. Unfortunately, I remember phoning my sister at the time and saying, "You're the only person I can contact. I can't get into my contacts because you're my emergency point of contact. What we're going to do?" So she's trying to Google how to reset my phone and break the lock. until I suddenly realized exactly what I'd done, which was I was consciously processing an unconscious pattern. I said, so the answer to that was stop, just talk about any shit possible to distract me until a notification comes through on my phone. And then as long as you're keeping me distracted enough, the unconscious processing will kick in and I will get back into my phone.
Yeah.
And that took 15 minutes.
So that's that automation on the
that's the
in the warehouse.
In the warehouse, yes. But sometimes we have new parcels that come down that we just don't know what to do. We don't know where they belong, where they're going. Maybe the shape or the size or the input of them is very unusual and it doesn't fit in with our standard processing. And that could be some of those traumatic events, some of those really triggering experiences that we have, that our brain just looks at that and says, I have no clue what to do with it. That's a bit like having that specialist night shift team that comes on. So the day shift goes, I have got no clue what to do with this. So I'll put it in the cage for night shift and they'll deal with it when they come in. Because then they're not dealing with the rest of this input. So they'll have the time to do a bit of an investigation, to try different things out and see where this piece of information now sits and belongs. So night shift's sole job is clearing the backlog of the unusual, the unexpected, the very different, the unique experiences that day shift haven't been able to auto-process. It does that quite often through our dreams. Most of those we'll be unaware of. But the ones that it really struggles with that night shift team is really struggling with, where it can't find where that belongs or how that's to be sent or packaged or processed, then they'll replay it over and over again because what they're trying to do is find that placement for it.
Yeah.
Trying to close out that final delivery of that item. What we end up with is night terrors and recurring dreams.
Yeah. But until that can be reprocessed and repackaged, that's going to carry on ad infinitum, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's the important part is, in a way, I mean, we talked previously when we were talking about PTSD about sometimes maybe we have to reconsider what our PTS symptoms are telling us. And what if they're just trying to get us an attention, that they're actually saying there's something we need your assistance with, your help with. What if that's what that night terror is telling us as well, is I don't know what to do with this piece of information. I don't know what to do with this experience. I need your help to process it through.
Yeah. And
that's where there are a number of things that we can then do, whether that's maybe working through some of those experiences with a trained professional during our daytime experiences. But there's also some dream techniques that we can utilize that help us then give that night shift team a bit more direction to help resolve that.
Yeah. So part of those night terrors are people not wanting to go to sleep because they'd experienced those terrors and those nightmares about physical sensations. So that'd be type 1 and type 2 insomnias.
Yeah.
And
I think for those people who are wondering what the difference is, the way I remember it, because sometimes I struggled for a long time to remember the difference between type 1 and type 2. The way I always remember it is the first thing you do is you go to sleep, and the second thing you do is you wake up. So type 1 insomnia is the ones where you struggle to get to sleep, and type 2 is the insomnia where you struggle to stay asleep.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, if you're constantly having very, very vivid night terrors, would you anticipate that the experience of sleep is positive or negative for you, Rich?
That'd be a pretty negative experience for most, whereas most people sleep is a very positive experience. Feeling refreshed and woken up in the morning.
Yeah, so if you're waking up to discover that you're in mid-panic attack, you've got hot flushes, you've got, maybe you're drenched in sweat, you've got the adrenaline rush going on, so you've got the shakes, the whole lot. You've got maybe probably sensations of nausea, it can be really, really extreme.
Potential harm to yourself as well, or others.
Yes. So that can make sleepy far from pleasant thing, something that you would anticipate if part of that anticipation is the night terror.
Yeah. And obviously the lack of sleep will make these symptoms worse because you're not getting a regular sleep hygienic pattern.
Well, I don't know about you, but I am really not good if I'm too exhausted. And they've done all these weird and wonderful experiments, and you see all these extreme examples of competitions where it's kind of like the hand in the car examples, where you've got all these crazy people trying to win the state-of-the-art car by seeing who can stay awake the longest and touching the vehicle.
Yeah, I believe they stopped that, didn't they? The Guinness Book of Records. Yeah.
But we can't forget that actually sleep deprivation has a real physical impact on us. It can kill us.
Yeah.
At a certain level, if you go without sleep long enough, your vital organs shut down.
Well, and aside from that, it's the decision-making process. So if you're not sleeping properly, you're going to making poor decisions. You know, maybe turning to substances that will help sleep and help alleviate those night terrors.
Well, if you think about, if I take you back to that analogy of the night shift and day shift crews, if you're not sleeping, then that means that day shift crew is on permanent overtime. That day shift crew, instead of doing a 12-hour shift or a 14-hour shift, is now doing an 18 or 20-hour shift. And in that 18 or 20 hours, it is continually processing all of those pieces, billions and billions of pieces of data. So not only is it on an overtime shift, but it is working like a Trojan for the entirety of that. And that cage of things, those auto pickers, are also an overwhelm and probably overheating, all sorts of issues going. Do you think about what happens in that assembly line?
Yeah, the machines break down eventually if it's continuously run.
Yeah, they overheat, parts wear out, things that would have been normal. You know, what happens if you don't put oil in your car engine?
It runs fine until it all blows up.
But along the way, you'll start to experience symptoms that something's going wrong, won't you?
Absolutely, yeah.
You might get the grinding, things might start to get a bit clunky. Things that normally were quite smooth, all of a sudden are anything but.
Yeah.
And sleep deprivation has the same impact on us. Things that would normally be done and we would be capable of doing without even so much as a second thought, become monumental tasks when we're sleep deprived.
And that also potentially affects the structure of the brain as well.
It does.
Because I think that's a subject for another time.
I would agree. Yeah. And there are things I think that we'll probably touch on again in a later episode, because I think you and I were talking about, wouldn't it be quite good if we did one specifically on sleep? And that way we could touch on again some of those wider issues in terms of what actually happens to the brain when we're sleep deprived.
Yeah.
And also some of the specific techniques that we can use to try and address some of those challenges.
Yeah. So there are, obviously these aren't prescriptive and we're not doctors who prescribe you anything. So there are ways to help you get to sleep, such as doing your best to have a regular sleeping pattern, a cool bed, possibly breathing techniques. So like we talked about in the first episode was box breathing, or breathe in for 4 and breathe out for 8. So basically breathe in for a certain amount and then attempt to double that breathing repetition, and do that for a few times. And also magnesium has been shown to help with sleep, because if I remember rightly, something like 70%, 70-80% of people in the United States are magnesium deficient. And it has something to do with 300 to 800 different functions within the body. So if we don't have the right vitamins and minerals, that's not going to help us recover as well.
Well, I think, and this is where my advice would be, if you're finding that your sleep pattern is far from ideal, check the basics. You know, how much caffeine are you consuming during the day? Because caffeine, while one of my favorites. I mean, I am a big coffee fan, but I also know that I'm very strict with myself that I don't drink coffee after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, I probably should limit that to probably after 10 o'clock in the morning, but there are limits in how long I can go without my caffeine for. But that also means I'm very careful about the caffeine that is in hidden sources. So whether that's in caffeinated drinks, apart from coffee, because you will come across caffeine elsewhere as well.
Yeah.
That could be, for instance, about how often we're using things like our mobile phones. Do you have a blue light filter on your phone? Because all of those can make a difference in terms of the brain activity and how it processes things as well. Removing electronics from the bedroom.
Yeah. And is the room as dark as it possibly can be as well? You know, how much ambient noise is there outside?
Have you thought about, for instance, maybe getting blackout curtains so that as the daylight patterns shift, then sometimes that also means that it will have an impact on our sleep patterns and our circadian rhythms. That's nature.
And on the other side of things is waking up in the morning, is getting that sunlight in the eyes for, I think it's about 10, 20 minutes, depending where you live in the world.
Well, one of my favorite things ever was when I discovered you could get the light activated alarm clocks. I think they're called body alarm clocks. And I used one of those for years, where actually there was no sound, but it would gradually raise and lower the light level in the room so that I could set it to a sunrise and sunset effect. And I found that fabulous in terms of
cool.
It was great. Loved it. So yeah, there are some things you can look at. And the other thing is don't be scared to have a conversation with your GP about that, because there may well be something else going on. And if you're not sleeping, then don't underestimate the impact it has on every aspect of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've covered today is going over flashbacks, and as well as night terrors and how they are just a sensory thing within the body, revisiting things that haven't yet been dealt with.
And we've also talked about that really kind of almost hidden superpower that if you're suffering from flashbacks and night terrors that you may well actually have, which is your ability to bridge between a very small piece of information and data byte of sensory input and a very vivid past experience that you may have.
Yeah.
Because that is a superpower, and that might be something we pick up maybe in a later episode when we start talking maybe about anchors and how they're created. Rich, I don't know whether you think that would be something that would be worth having a conversation at a later date about.
I think we could ask the listeners that.
I think we could, yeah.
Yeah. And triggers. So what could be a very pleasant smell for somebody else could be an upsetting experience for yourself.
Yeah.
So be mindful of where you are and what's going to upset you or what's not going to upset you.
And if you know that you have something that you find particularly triggering, then actually maybe that's a conversation you can have with those closest to you, or those that you work with, that says actually it would be really helpful if. And bearing in mind that these triggers can literally be anything. They can be a sound that everybody else wouldn't even notice. They could be a color, they could be an object, they can be a smell, as you say, or it can be a sensation, something that you touch or that's felt. Any of that and all of those are possible.
And have a good night's sleep.
Yeah. Check your sleep hygiene, check your room hygiene, your patterns, and again, if anybody's interested in looking at some of the elements or the things that you can do to help alleviate some of those night terrors, drop us a note and maybe we'll do a bit more of a specific deep dive into that later on too.
Definitely. So thank you for listening to our podcast. And where can they find us, Ali?
They can find us, well, you can find us on the majority of the popular podcast channels, such as Spotify, Anchor, Castbox. You can find us on Amazon Music and hopefully soon Apple too. And you can also find us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. And where else?
We have a LinkedIn page, and we're also on YouTube as well.
We are indeed. And also, if you are wanting to have a conversation with us, whether that's by email or just to pass on your thoughts, you can do that either on any of those social media platforms. And if you looked at our LinkedIn page, etc., then you'll also find links to our email address so you can email Rich and I.
Awesome. Thanks, Ali.
Thank you.
and see you soon.